Hey everyone, this is Kevin and Tori, and we're doing our Unscripted podcast today. We're going to talk about decision rights or sorry, decision making, including decision rights. And to start provocatively, I thought I would sort of pose the statement, I guess, that we're probably not all as good at decision making as we think we are. Tori, would you want to take that, statement and kind of poke at that?
100%. Well, and we are not as good at decision making as we think we are. There is research showing this, right? Danny Kahneman, Nobel Prize winning economist, has basically said we rarely feel stumped. And so we have this overconfidence in our decision making ability, in our knowledge. That's a whole different thing, Dunning-Kruger effect. And so for anyone out there who thinks I'm pretty good at making decisions, I think today we'd hope to challenge that and say there's probably room to get better. Wherever you are, however you make decisions, however effectively you make decisions, there's room to improve, and we're often overconfident in our own decision-making capacities. So hopefully, Kevin, you and I today will unpack what makes decision-making, effective decision-making so challenging and how we can do it better. I don't know,
Yeah.
Kevin, how are you at decision-making?
Well, I don't know. One of the things I think is interesting is that, if you get a perspective beyond yourself, and one of the ways to do that is to watch other people make decisions, you start to realize that not everyone makes a decision the same way you do. And that just, in my mind, creates some optionality. Like, oh, I can make decisions faster. I can make decisions more alone. I could make them with more people. I could get more input. I could look at more data. You just start to see all the ways in which decisions are made, which then implies there may be methods that are more effective and less effective. And then you can start to see where you might be on that spectrum yourself and start to tip yourself in better directions. And also recognizing that context matters. And, there's like the right decision methodology for the context. And, if you have an urgent thing that needs to be done, you can't take a more maybe consensus driven approach. You have to be a little different. So you also recognize that. But I think that's true is seeing that different people make decisions in different ways. That opens up the idea that maybe there's a more effective way than less. And maybe we'll talk about some of those different ways today. Does that make you think of anything that is maybe a first path that we could sort of decompose decision making?
Yes, and the first thing I want to do, and I know this might be challenging to do, we're talking about decision making and decision making paths and processes. Let's get concrete if we can. What do we mean by decision?
Okay, you're throwing it to me to decide
Yeah, well,
in
I'm
that.
throwing it to
Okay.
both of us. Like, let's see if
Uh,
we can quickly take a working definition for decision, like a choice between two options, a choice whether or not to move forward, like a go, no go. What makes something a decision?
I hadn't pre-thought of a definition of decision, but in my brain, what I often visualize, my visualized visual person, is I kind of think of the branching paths. You've got a fork in the road, sometimes there's one or two paths, and maybe there's an infinite number, but just something like that where you have an optionality that you're choosing to exercise. That's kind of my definition.
Nice. And I will include in that the optionality to move or not move,
Mhm.
right? Because I see a lot of folks who sort of have that, like, should I stay or should I go type
Mhm.
decision. And so that, like, look, are you going to take a step forward from where you are? And then which step are you going to take? Which path? I
Sure.
think that moment of choice, that moment where you've got options in front of you, including the option to do nothing or do something, and ideally do one of possible somethings, that moment where you are pausing to consider between multiple options,
Yeah.
that is what comes to mind for me, decision, when we say decision.
And maybe this is a good time to introduce the different framings around one-way doors and two-way doors and other, types of thinking about that. And, so one-way door and two-way door, I think, is attributed typically to Jeff Bezos, whether he's the first person or not, I don't know. That was difficult for me to understand at first. Like, what are you talking about? And, oh, there's only two types of decisions. It's either one or two. And so to explain at least the initial definition, a one-way door is the kind that closes behind you. Once you go through, you cannot return back the way you came. The other two-way door just means that once you walk in, you could just, I don't want to be here, and you turn around and walk back out. Sometimes I found it's very difficult to classify those because, and I'll give you an example. It's like, if you were going to rebrand your company, you announce that you're changing the name. That seems like it's a one-way door in the sense that now that you've announced it, you can't unannounce it. However, you could make a subsequent decision to change the name back, so in that regard, it is kind of a two-way door. So I just didn't find the framing as helpful to me as the other one around like hats, haircuts, and tattoos. To think about the permanence of a decision. So, a hat kind of decision is the kind like you literally put on a hat, you take it off. maybe your hair is a little bit creased, but like really there's very little impact. So those are very low impact decisions. A haircut, your hair will grow back, but if you choose something a little funky, it may take a while before you get back to something else. And so those are a little bit more well considered. And then lastly, you've got the tattoo. The tattoo is a pretty permanent decision. And so those you might want to approach it in a different, more considered way. And so that's one way to sort of think about these optionalities you have and sort of maybe the intensity of a decision. How do you think about those frameworks? Have you used those? What are your thoughts?
I like the hats. I like that notion of the permanence and how permanent is this decision. I agree with you that the one-way door and two-way door for me I find unsatisfying just because the number of true one-way doors is so small. But I think even that insight is really valuable because when we're making decisions, our mind can tend to conceive of them as a one-way door, right? That this is it. And that once I'm through, everything is different and there's no turning back and there's no subsequent decisions. So I think even the realization that, like, hey, 99% of the time, this is a two-way door, even though I'm trying to think of it as a one-way door, I'm afraid of what happens if I'm wrong on the other
Yep.
side and I'm stuck. I think that is the one thing that helps me from that one-way, two-way, less like, let's
Yep.
categorize this as more almost by default, it's a two-way door. And then the hats actually gives us more granularity of how permanent is the impact of this
Yeah.
decision.
Because the way I think about that same thing you're saying is most decisions are reversible or they can be adjusted a week later, and that really lowers the intensity and energy of any given decision. Once you see that, and even things as intense as, I left my 10-year career company 4 months ago. At some level that is a one-way door, and I guess it is in the sense that I can't is easily turn around and hey, actually, I want to go back. That said, there are so many subsequent decisions to that. Like I chose to go on my own. I could have chosen to get another job. I could choose to reorient my business in a different way. There are like a million things that I could do. I could move to change my opportunity set or my cost basis, like just a million decisions after that. And so even though the first one felt like a very intense, one-way door kind of thing, actually, there's many different things I could do, and it's just one decision of many, actually.
100%. Well, and I work with folks who have left academia, and that can feel like a one-way door. I've left academia. It's not. People go back. People have left and gone back, right? And left that world and then entered back into it. I would argue that in my framing, probably the only one true one-way door I can think of is becoming a parent. Just
Mm,
because, you may become a parent and then who knows, maybe even you lose your child, you're still a parent.
yep,
It's like this flip.
yep,
So that's probably one of the few, other than like life, death, that is true one way.
yes,
Nearly
yes,
anything else for me, I can frame as a two-way because if you work hard enough, you can turn it around. So
yep.
I think then saying, okay, now that nearly all decisions are two-way, how do we identify them? I think that's really interesting then to get to classify. I don't know if that resonates with you. I don't know if there are other one-way doors that you can think of,
I
but
mean,
for
again, same like you, I went on a journey of like, wow, what is really a one-way door? And then you think of something like, I guess cutting off my leg would be something, but you could also get a prosthetic and then you've got, I don't know, like it's really hard to probe. And again, I didn't like the binary classification of it either. But I will say one of the things, if we take that implication of like, oh, okay, so most decisions are reversible. What does that then mean for us as decision makers? I think one of the implications is that speed becomes really important. So rather than deliberating or debating or, kind of pondering your navel for forever, you should just make a decision because you're now generating data. You're generating insight and information on the world around you by making a decision, and that improves the quality of every subsequent decision that you might make. And so I think speed is a huge, like, kind of yeah, now that we know that most decisions are reversible, we should really think about how to make fast decisions. Generally speaking, we'll probe at that nuance even, but what do you think about speed as an implication?
I agree, and it's so interesting. So I think if we agree that then vast majority of decisions are reversible, we should make them faster. I would put another condition now that we know that most decisions are reversible, which is we make space to be wrong,
Mhm.
right? Like in all likelihood, some of the decisions we make will be wrong because when we have this one door mentality, we tend to say, I might be wrong, so I'm not going to make a decision at all. Tends to slow us down, right? We punt on making the decision for as long as we can. And so to me, almost another condition that we hold and then that allows us to move faster is permission to be wrong. We will be wrong, prepare to be wrong. And
Yep.
because these are reversible decisions, we know that other decisions will come up that we can move backwards, we can reroute if we find something wrong. And so I think that permission to be wrong allows us speed, allows us permission in a way that when we view decisions as irreversible, we don't give ourselves that opportunity.
Yeah, I don't know if you could have seen on the podcast people, but I was like my eyebrows were scrunching, which means like I'm thinking about something. And I when you said wrong, it just my brain started, how do I think about that? Because I think that might be helpful for someone who does think in a right and wrong, as opposed to like information gathering, or there's a book called How to Think Like a Rocket Scientist that talks about whenever there's a failure, you throw up your hands and say how fascinating. And so I'm with you on the concept. I think the language was just something that I was trying to figure out my own perspective on, where decisions aren't really right or wrong. We live in a probabilistic world, and it either your hypothesis was true or untrue, or there's probably some other framings around it. But I like to emphasize the learning aspect, which I think what you're getting at as well, which is, you do something, you kind of roll the dice, you see what happens, and you're like, oh, that's not the direction I wanted this to go, and then you can make an adjustment. What do you think about my kind of quizzical wondering about right and wrong?
And so I think it's interesting because you and I probably help folks make different types of decisions. And that
Mm,
in business decisions, it's sort of like, hey, whatever decision you make, you learn new things. I think often helping folks make career decisions,
mm,
and by career decisions, I mean the do I quit the job? What do I do next? I think those are decisions where people have a lot more value judgments
mm,
and a lot more like this is societally acceptable to do this. Sort of like, do I get married? Do I buy a house? Do I have kids? Like, there are almost more moral beliefs about some notion of right
yep.
than should we invest resources in sales or marketing, right? That more is just, okay, what's going to work for our company? And realistically, for individuals, people should approach it as what's going to work for me, what's going to allow me to contribute to the world in the way that I want. But we put a lot more moralizing on those decisions. And so I do think the word wrong shows up a lot more when I'm talking with folks about life decisions, career decisions, than, say implementation or resourcing decisions. And so that's where I see a lot of fear around wrong, but it may be because you and I work with folks in different
Yeah.
decision spaces.
Yeah, that is interesting. And you're right. I'm laughing. Like, what are some of the decisions people make? And I was thinking about which tier of Google Workplace should my business. Man, just pick one. Like, it's
Yeah,
really
yeah,
not
yeah,
that
exactly,
expensive to do something.
exactly.
And then you might be choosing resourcing. You choose hiring and firing. It can get pretty intense when you get more advanced. But yeah, in general, different kinds of decisions. Which maybe gets into like we could talk about resulting and how separating the decision quality from the outcome. And so just to introduce that idea, I was saying earlier that we do live in a probabilistic, complex environment. There's interactions we don't understand and can't model. And at some point you just have to do the thing and see, kind of where the universe will land. But what that means then is that you can separate the result of your decision from the decision process. So, I bet there's a quadrant that someone's drawn before where, you've got a good decision that has the outcome you wanted, and then you have a bad decision process that has the outcome you want. And then you have the inverse of both, where, something that you cared to have happen did happen, but you had an awful process by which you got there, and you just happened to get lucky, as opposed to the skill of your decision making. And so I do think that's something that is challenging for people as they first start getting into this is really separating those out, because you're so tied in. And I think there's the anecdote I remember from a book, and I won't remember everyone's name, but football coach did a different call, at the end of the Super Bowl. They lost the game, and everyone's mad at the coach because they lost the game, and that's what everyone cares about, is winning. And the coach is saying, I made the best decision based on the data and the information I had at the time, and just the luck of the draw meant that we lost the game, but it doesn't mean it was a bad decision. And so that example always kind of resonates with me as far as how to understand. So, what are your thoughts on kind of resulting and the probabilistic nature of the universe we live in?
That example is the one at the beginning of Thinking in Bets by Annie
Is it
Duke.
okay? That's very good. Yeah,
Great book. And then
great book.
actually, Annie Duke has that quadrant of good process, good outcome, good process, bad outcome, etc., in her book, How to Decide. And
Mhm.
How to Decide is almost like a workbook that you're supposed to be working through with exercises like that. Thinking in
Mhm.
Bets is more the sort of overview of this whole thing. But
Yeah.
I love her framing and I love the concept of resulting because it really helps us remember that decision making is, you know, anticipating outcomes in light of uncertainty. And so our process to do that is going to be different from the outcome that turns out. And that resulting, this notion that just because I got a good outcome, I had a good process. Yeah, okay, raise an eyebrow. And then just because I had a bad outcome, I had a bad process, right?
Mhm.
Like the Monday morning quarterbacking example. I
Yep.
think it really encouraged us to focus on process. And actually, I love watching poker for this reason. I don't know if you've ever watched any Texas Hold'em on TV, but what they do is when someone picks up a hand, they show the probability of that hand winning. And
Mhm.
what it reminds you of is that at least in terms of the cards, right? The other players are variables, but at least in terms of the cards, when you have cards and there's a certain number of cards shown, there is just a probability of success.
Yep.
That in life, we rarely have that degree of certainty. There's no
Yep.
fixed deck. The value of outcomes differs. But
Yep.
you can really calculate, okay, what's my probability of winning? Then you can go back and say, did I make the correct bets in light of the probabilities, or did I not remember the probabilities, right? Probably for an early poker player. But I love that certainty because it reminds us that, okay, in that type of situation, you can get really rigorous. You also get a ton of revs, a ton of repetitions in poker. And so there's a decision-making process there that I think we can learn from. I love Annie Duke's books because it reminds you that life is a lot like poker, where it's a lot of probabilistic decisions with even less information. But yeah, I do think that resulting tendency is something we all have. We all tend to look at outcomes and just say, good decision. That turned out good decision. So the
Yeah.
reminder there that that's not the case. And then the examples from poker that she brings in her book, I think really have helped me to look at this more as a probabilistic exercise and to take it out of some of the frames of right and wrong, emotion, resulting, all these things that we tend to do when we haven't looked at decision making carefully.
Yeah. But first, I was laughing about I'd love to be in an interview where there's an overlay that says the probability that this person is going to be successful in their role. It'd be so helpful to all the hiring managers out there.
Yeah.
But the implications for me on bets, I like the term she uses, bets, because it's sort of like the follow-on thought process. Okay, so the decision process is different from the result, and so there's a probability, and so what you're doing is a bet, and you're betting, and I like to use that language. I bet that if I do X, then Y will happen. And it kind of reminds you that there's a probability here. And then to me, the follow on from that is if you have a probability, you can ask what you can do to stack the odds in your favor. Because now you see the agency you have on the outcome versus if you don't see that, then you make a decision and you wait to see what the result is. You're like, okay, I did it. And now the machine will process and the result will come out at the other end without seeing the agency you have. And so I really like the idea of like you have a bet, there's a probability, which means that probability could be something you can influence. So now what can you do to stack the odds in your favor? What are your thoughts on that?
That actually aligns with a quote I pulled out. So I was reading the
Great.
HBR Guide to Decision Making and reviewing for this call just to look at what HBR had to say. And one of the best things I saw there was a quote from an executive coach, this person named Ed Batista, who I hadn't heard of. But he said, stop worrying about making the right decision, focus on making the choice turn out right.
Mhm.
And so it was basically this look, like you said, we can sometimes make the decision and then just wait and say, like, did I do it right? Right. But like both the decision making process and then afterwards, the what do I do to support getting the outcome that I want? What about all the subsequent decisions where I can continue to drive outcomes rather than sort of leaving it up to fate? I think that mindset that we can have sometimes in decision making is this is outside of our control. And it's healthy because some of it is. Some of it is entropy, some of it is randomness. That probabilistic reminder is important so that we don't get our omnipotent God complex overconfidence on.
Yeah.
So I think it's good to remember that there is some randomness. But if we let there be too much randomness, if we say the world determines where I go and I have no influence over it, and so I'll just make the decisions and then let the wheel spin, that can also be a problem. And so I think finding that healthy balance of I have some influence over decision making here. I can go out and support this, and there will be randomness that I can't predict. I think that middle ground is probably the place to be. How's that sound for you?
I'm laughing because maybe a meta comment. It's like this conversation is making me think of going in two directions, and I have to choose which direction I think to take the conversation. So I'm gonna
How are you going to choose, Kevin?
Yeah, my thought is it's around creating choices. That's what I'm hearing here is that, instead of feeling like it's passive and there's just choices, you pick a lever and it goes left or right. It's like we have agency in this, and one of the ways we have agency is creating a great choice. And it's really, I think, an advanced thing. It's very hard for someone to recognize the agency they have on the universe and being able to go in and say, actually, you're presenting three options to me, or that's what we all see on the table. But hey, if we challenge this assumption, we actually can go upstream, we do this different thing, and we create a whole another set of options that are, much higher probability of success, greater outcomes for us. And so, just recognizing that you even get to decide whether the thing you're deciding is what you should decide. You're going somewhere else and kind of challenging. So yeah, I love. I think it's Roger Martin was the first book I read on creating choices. I think that might be the name of the book, Creating Great Choices. I think he calls it Integrative Thinking. Might be another book on that, but it's essentially, you're really stepping back and saying, what is the system upon which I'm trying to influence? What are the ways I can create an outcome that's a better option for me than, maybe what I first see in front of me? So, what are your thoughts on kind of creating choices?
Well, and it's funny, so there's creating great choices, which I like. I like that framing. As a coach, part of my training is reminding folks when they are at choice, right?
Mhm.
So it's even just remembering moments where folks don't feel like they have a choice and reminding folks, like, yes, nearly everything you're in is a choice. The job you're in, the relationship you're in, the way you treat your health. There are choices there, but people can forget. They can forget to give themselves that agency. They can fall into ruts and inertia. So I think even before creating the right choice, you have to create the right to have a choice, right? You have to create that agency. And so part of coaching is just reminding folks that they're at choice. I
Yeah.
then think when it comes to creating that right choice, I liked, so Chip and Dan Heath in this book, Decisive, had these sort of four villains of decision making. And I like those when I'm thinking about, okay, how do you create a right choice, right? The things they called out were narrow framing, where we unduly limit our options, right? And you're talking about that, where you sort of collapse down the space of what's possible unwittingly. They call that confirmation bias, where we then go out and seek information to bolster our existing desire for a decision. They talk about emotion led decision making and that we make decisions based on the immediate emotion, what we expect we'll feel. And then they talk about the overconfidence, right? What we referenced up top in this conversation is that we each feel way too much confidence in our predictions and our decision making ability. And so I think that when we talk about creating a good choice, recognizing those as well as recognizing the biases and heuristics beyond confirmation bias that we suffer from, we can create better decision spaces, better decision architecture when we know that. I'll bet you have a lot of solutions there, but before we get to the solutions, anything else to say on those sort of challenges?
Well, those are interesting. I think the narrow frame just reminds me, I'll give an example, I think, which connects to the creating choices and just recently, doing a process optimization project. And, I created my own inertia where it's like, okay, what is the process? Map it out. Then I'm like, okay, our goal is to compress this, make it in. Oh, I could optimize this thing and I could automate that thing. And as I was going in, essentially I had an option to use, let's say Zapier or N8N. It's like I'm choosing which thing. And then I don't even remember what made me stop and say, like, wait a second, why are we even sending these files in this way or this information in this way? What would be a completely different process to this? So it turns out that was a much better option. Instead of me choosing which automation platform and, automating particular steps, it's like we could not need to have this entire process at all. And so went to a kind of native software solution that had a bunch of other benefits. And now it's like, it's going to save, I don't know, 5 to 10 times the amount of time I was going to save for my original option and had to create. And so that was sort of a narrow frame, I think. It's like, oh, I'm down here in the weeds. I could choose this platform or that platform. But you have to kind of go conscious and remind yourself of a different framing. So that was my example on the narrow frame. Just wanted to share. So
Yeah, well, so I'll circle back with a question there. Other than it just occurring to you, if you were going to say to folks a way to get out of that narrow frame, was it just asking yourself why? What's the bigger significance here? How might folks get out of that space of should I choose Zapier or this other tool up to what's the bigger goal?
I'll have to think about that. You're making me think of the four stages of competence, where you're sort of unconsciously incompetent, then you can be consciously incompetent, then you're consciously competent, and then I in this one, it's like I literally can't think of what happened and why. It wasn't like there was a trigger. I don't have a thing that I remind myself. And, there's another universe in which I was distracted and picked one of those platforms and optimized the thing. And, that's the choice I made. It just so happens that I think I've done this enough, that I thought about it enough, that I really try to remind myself of why I'm doing what I'm doing. And in this case, I knew it was around like kind of big picture view. It's around scaling this organization. And so when I thought about like what creates scale, and I just had maybe the intuition that what I was doing was peanuts, in the grand scheme of things, it's like, sure, okay. And I could be proud of that work, but I was like, there's got to be something better. And so I think it's just the experience, and then, just kind of the taking a big picture view and reminding yourself of the bigger why, and then, kind of looking at, what's really worth doing, and was this worth doing? I don't know. Maybe it's an unsatisfying answer, but
No, no, no. And I think that's what I was hearing, right? That like connecting to the bigger picture why helps us situate the decisions we're making. But this is one where I think I'm going to circle back to something you said and disagree with it tentatively and
cool.
then see. As I was reading about decision making, I think one of the things that it played out for me is that when we slow down and go through a process, the quality of decisions improves.
Mhm.
Like asterisk hypothesis. That's the sense I was getting. And again, my natural sense is like, screw that. I was around way too much indecision and way too much slow decision. Like, make it fast, deal with what's wrong, etc. And so I wonder if we can consider that sort of, when does it make sense to slow down? How do you slow down? And yet not pay the costs that you pay of a slow decision. If we think about decision making velocity and the sort of pace of these different processes versus the costs of indecision versus bad decisions, that's a lot of different things to throw at you at once. But I'm curious what thoughts come to mind.
Well, I'm thinking about another example. Maybe I'll give it just so that we can get it out there for us to play with. But it was another example of, I was being tasked with an execution, like, hey, Kevin, can you go figure out how to do this? And so I started figuring out like, how do I do this? Which then comes with an assortment of options. Oh, I could do this or that. And then again, why are we even doing this? So kind of a similar thing where you kind of like try to prevent the decision you're doing to go upstream. And it's like, none of this is necessary if I can challenge the root of why that task came. And I think partly so we can have the example. The other part is to recognize we're making decisions all the time. And some of them are so small that it doesn't feel like there's a process. Like the task that came to me was probably someone seeing something, being triggered and saying, oh, we should do that. And then the task is sent to me. And that's a process in a sense, but it's sort of an unconscious process. And we just do those all the time. And so I think there's an kind of an intentionality. What deserves a process, and that might come back down to the hats, haircuts, and tattoos. And if there's something less than a hat, the process doesn't really need to be that robust, because you're going to spend more money and time debating the decision versus the implications of the decision. And so I like a good process. I agree with you that they are likely to create a better quality outcome. I think it's really important for people and companies and teams to establish a process, but really understand what level of decision needs to go through that process. And I think one of the biggest risks for anybody is, processes are these little black holes. You set a decision-making process, and then lo and behold, everything goes through that, even things that shouldn't go through that. And I think one of the biggest wastes in decision making is that, where you spend so much time getting so many people to prepare for, research, debate a decision that has no business going through that process. So that's my big mess of thoughts to share back on yours. What does that trigger for you?
Well, and it's interesting because for me, and I think this is coming from my reading, if we look at types of decision-making processes,
Mhm.
right? You can say that intuitive decisions are a process. They're just the fastest process, right? It's just go with your gut, boom, right? Like that intuitive is sort of the quickest, most automatic process. After that, another process I saw for decision making is analytical. Do some analysis, right? Think about some possible forecast outcomes and make a decision. That might be the sort of next level of thought process has to add to it. The third level would be something that is really process led, right? Like a decision that goes through a formal decision making process. And I guess I wonder, I think for us, what types of decisions make sense for each of those types of processes. And actually, the research I was reading, I can't remember if this is an HBR in the Heath book, was saying that there was some study by a McKinsey person showing that we think the ones with lots of analysis would lead to
Mm.
higher quality decisions, but actually the process was more impactful than the analysis when they basically covariated the two and looked at the interaction effects. And so trying to think, okay, what are the tattoo decisions? What are the decisions we want to slow down where the costs of an ineffective decision are so high that it's worth paying the costs of the process versus what are the hat decisions where,
Mm.
the sort of, okay, we can take it off very quickly. I think having a sense of which types of decision fall into each, we could make a categorical thing that all decisions should be intuitive or all decisions should go through a process. But I'll bet there is some, even before you make a decision on how you want to make a decision that maybe
Yes.
there could be a rule of thumb around. I don't know what's coming to your mind for you here.
Well, I bet it sounds like these were it's intuitive, analytical, or process that I heard, but I bet the people that came up with that would also agree they're not mutually exclusive. You could include elements. You could have a process that includes analysis and also a level of intuition. And so that's what I was thinking for myself, because I know that, I'm a business of one. So, the types of decisions I make don't really require a process because there's not that many people involved. But I do like to use analysis, and I also am trying to get more in tune with my intuition and making decisions. And so, yeah, they all kind of play around. I do think you're right that, you could create some little mental framework or mental model of, the type of decision. And, this one's allowed to be intuitive. I can just feel which one I want and I can go down that path. And then and I think that's probably more appropriate for the lower cost decisions. Um, I, I will make an aside and say that I am an analytical person, maybe to a fault. Like I'm a very systems oriented, very analytical. And when I mentioned kind of getting in tune with intuition, it's recognizing what intuition is, which I think is just pattern recognition over time that you've turned subconscious. And it's information in its own right that is based on your life experience, and it's something that I should be in tune more with. And so I think there's a power in intuition, and I wouldn't say that it's any better or worse than analysis. And you should recognize, like, why is my body creating a sensation based on this experience that I can't verbalize, and knowing that it comes from all of the, like, your body has absorbed all the lessons learned in your past, and there's something there. So yeah, intuition is a very sound methodology, even for more advanced decision types. It's not like intuitive is the worst, and okay, fine, intuitive is bad, but it's okay to use it on cheap decisions or low expensive, and you should abandon that and go analytical or process. I think there's a place for intuition even on more severe ones. Do you agree with that?
Oh, 100%. Well, and I think again, like I mentioned before, on the like two ends of the spectrum being problematic, I think intuition, if there's too much or too little, it's a problem, right? So
Mhm.
if there's too much, okay, you're foregoing analysis. You're that leader who just thinks that everything that you think is the right decision and you're not asking for any input on it. And even though you run a multinational with a lot of people on your team, you just believe in your own intuitions, right? Like that can have a problem. And again, your intuition has value, but it's one input of many. And so
Mhm.
overweighting it and overconfidence in it is a problem. I also see folks who have underconfidence in it. And I think this comes from job decisions, career choices, where we never even ask ourselves what we want. That is not even an input in folks' job decisions because there's so much value judgment around what you should be doing, what the right thing to do is when I give folks permission to ask themselves what they want in their job, it's like for some folks, head exploding. Like I'm
Mhm.
allowed to feature this
Yeah,
into the
what?
decision. And then people end up burned out and unhappy in jobs. And it's like, well, you never asked yourself what you wanted,
Yeah.
or you asked yourself and you didn't get a very high quality answer, right? Which is also true. If we're not very used to asking our intuition what we want, the data we get back early on is a little bit low res. And so I think that practice of consulting intuition and knowing it as one like sort of seat at the decision-making table. And that, yes, for some decisions of like, what do you want to eat for lunch? It might be fine to let it be the only decision maker at the table.
Yeah.
But that, the sort of not incorporating it at all has issues. Incorporating it and relying on it too much has issues. But intuition should absolutely be a feature in vast majority of decisions. I would wager. I would put an asterisk by that. I'm open to being disagreed, but like
I think it's
intuition
an
and
information channel.
input.
I think it's an information channel, and you wouldn't want to discount an information channel. You want to let it come through, assess it, and use it along with everything else. And but this conversation is making me think back to the very beginning of our conversation today, where we talked about all the different types of decision making. And I was saying, I worked at Atlassian for over a decade. I was used to the same decision makers, and so kind of became a fish in water. Just, oh, this is how we make decisions, and you're kind of there. And now being independent, I'm working with so many different leaders who have so many different styles. It's been really fun. And I think there's some who aren't conscious, just to bring like, we should get conscious about how we make decisions. And, I've seen people that I think I'll describe it as a little more intuitive. It's not a perfect description, but a leader who knows their decision to make, and they kind of are contemplating, but they won't make a decision. They're not asking for any more information. They're just kind of like stuck. And at the end, they like make a snap judgment on something because it just has to happen. And I don't know, there's not analysis involved. There wasn't really a process. They're just kind of very intuitive, and they're kind of making a snap decision at the end. I've seen other leaders where even for the tiniest decision, we are debating it a lot, and we're arguing and we're going back and forth, we're spending time. And that got back where I was thinking about decision cost. If you're debating option A or option B, and option B, maybe I'll use that Google Workplace. If you're choosing between the two tiers, the cost of the second tier for a two-person company is like $7 a month or something like that. And if you spend 1 hour debating that with two people, that's, let's say, $500 you just spent in time. That would take 6 years of the higher cost option to pay back the time you spent. Like, just pick. It literally doesn't matter. And I think if you're not really careful about being intentional about how you're approaching decisions, again, you use the wrong methodology where you're like, oh, decisions are important and we're going to have a process. And then you spend 100x the cost on the decision process for decisions. So anyway, those are my like lived examples recently. What is that bringing up for you?
Well, it really makes me want to, and again, maybe we can't do this, but really want to classify decisions because I think as you're talking, I'm hearing two costs that folks don't appreciate and should. One is the cost of indecision,
Mhm.
right? These decisions you punt on that just sit around without a decision for a long time that you sort of know are decision points and you just punt, 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 punt. Especially, having worked for leaders who were indecisive,
Mhm.
that was felt as an employee, and I see it in individuals who don't make career next steps even though they know they want something more. So there's cost of indecisions, and then we can probably also calculate the cost of a wrong decision, right? Like you just said there with the workspace, it's like realistically the cost of a wrong decision here is so low. Go make the wrong decision. It doesn't even matter. It's more fruitful for you to make a wrong decision than to spend time. And so, almost for ourselves, if there could be a quick matrix, and maybe this is just defining this, or maybe there's a framework for this around, how urgent is this decision? What's the cost of indecision? And then what's the cost of being wrong? Because I think if we had that, it might enable us to be speedy in the cases where we should be speedy
Yep.
and to be slower on these decisions of like, okay, if you get married to that someone that's a lot slower to walk back, and so that's a weightier decision. That should be one that's slower versus right, like should you buy Google Workspace or not, right, or which tier. And so if we can try to come up with classes of decisions, I don't know if there's something that you have read or something that is coming to mind for you in terms of like
Yep.
decisions that fall into different
A little
quadrants.
bit, I would say. Is it A.G. Lafley in the Playing to Win book about Procter and Gamble strategy? It's a strategy book, a very good strategy book. And one of the statements in there is about freedom in the frame. And they talk about a strategic cascade. You can't have one person making every type of decision for every company. And so there is this cascade in there. Now it's really emphasizing their framework around where to play, how to win, et cetera. But you can think of the same thing here. It's like, what is the frame within which people can make decisions? Which I've been waiting to talk about this, and it's the idea of moving authority to information. Um, it's that same thing where it's like, if you define a process, we're going to connect a couple of dots here. Hopefully, it's like, okay, you've got a process for decision making. Then, like a black hole, it absorbs all decisions. Then you've got these very inexpensive decisions that now you're not deciding while it goes through the process. That's the way it feels to the, let's say, the frontline staff. You've got a large org, they're deciding whether they can do a project or not. That decision goes into this now like just 100 decision process. You're waiting a month, you're waiting 6 weeks. That's an indecision. You've decided to wait. Now, the actual cost of implementing that project might have been 2 weeks. And so that's so silly when you really think about it. You're like, oh, we want to protect bad decisions and wasting resources. So we're going to have this robust process to make sure that we're not going to make any mistakes. And then, the team is producing all this content to educate someone who doesn't know anything about this to make a good decision. And you waste 5, 10, 100 times the cost of the actual decision. Like it's so silly. And so that's what I'm hearing in this cost of indecision. And you've got this process, and you've wasted all this time when you were ostensibly trying to avoid waste. And so it's just a silly thing that happens in a larger team, a larger company as a byproduct of just human nature and system design.
Oh yeah, well, an over system, over process that like let's have a process to approve our process. That can
Yep.
absolutely happen. And I would say there are costs of underthinking,
Mhm.
right? Say for a decision of firing someone. I've seen a decision of firing someone that happens on split
Yep.
judgment, right? And that sort of decision is like, hey, is this actually a situation that is intractable? Could
Yep.
there be a way where we could get more out of this talent? What's going on that's not working, right? A moment to slow down and see if you can get that, just because firing someone is an expensive decision, not to mention the like,
Life impact. Yeah.
the the social consequences, but just as a pure business decision. If you now don't have talent there, you've slowed down fellow talent who has to pick up their projects. You're going to go out and have to hire again, which is very expensive.
Yep.
So making that type of decision snap, intuitive, has costs. And again, you could argue that even if it's wrong, those costs are absorbable. But that notion of is it then worth an hour to sit down and think about that versus the whatever it is, there's some number around the cost it takes to replace someone in terms of like the percentage of their salary you're going to have to pay sourcing them. But
Yep.
right, if you're imagining you're paying some $30,000 cost in order to replace someone, then yeah, spending an hour to think about it might be worthwhile.
Yep.
And so I don't know if there's like a proxy of quickly like what's the cost of a wrong decision. And I do think that for large companies, what I've observed is the cost of doing something wrong is higher than the cost of doing nothing. So they would rather do nothing. So if I take, for example, Google, where Google is a lot of brand, right? Protecting the brand impact. And so if they go out and do something that is off brand and that gets bad press, that risks their brand. Where the vast majority of things we could do as projects, the sort of revenue upside versus the
Yep.
revenue downside of doing something wrong, the calculus pushed really in favor of do nothing. And so I found this very frustrating as an employee because I like to do things, but
Mhm.
the notion of like we've got to overcome this huge cost of perceived impact of one bad action. So we got to go through this alignment building and consensus building progress to do anything. We can argue that that's not efficient for a business that is still growing. But for a business that is in the sort of defend and protect as opposed to the grow phase,
Yep.
that calculus might make sense. So I do
Yeah.
think in addition to the type of the decision, there's almost the like, which types of negative impacts are we willing to absorb? And at least within Google, the like, we're willing to absorb negative brand impacts was zero, right? It was like, if this has any risk of a brand impact, this has any risk of internal blowback. When I worked in HR for a little while at Google, like it was just no, just don't do it, just don't do anything. And so it was a
Yeah.
system set up to create no-goes intentionally, right? If we think of that go,
Yep.
no go, like it was
Yep.
actually tipping the scales that way. And so I do think it can be over processed, but I can actually mentally justify why that process to slow down decision making served their end objectives.
Yeah, that makes sense. And bigger companies are a level of complexity and interest that make like a fertile ground, I guess, for these kind of discussions because that makes sense. But at the same time, I guess maybe I'll add that because there's so many players involved, that's often why those decisions have to get real weird and slow. Is because you're the way that the org structure is designed, you're there's an implication or an assumption on a decision that it's going to impact someone else, but they're not necessarily involved in the process that you're deciding. And so you have all these weird, like kind of a wave. You might decide to do something as a group, then you share that decision with another group that's like, hey, wait a second, we aren't privy to that decision. We were already booked. And so now what do we have to change? And that wave has to come back and you're like, oh, well, they're not available. So you decide to change the scope. So it gets real interesting with those larger companies for sure.
It was really funny. I saw some public comments. Sundar, the CEO of Google, let's see if Alphabet. No, he's the CEO of. Is he CEO of Google or Alphabet? I don't know. I think he's the CEO of Alphabet, and then Larry's still the chairman, whatever it is. But he made some comment publicly about like, we're going to try to reduce the number of people who make a decision from three to two. And I was like, oh, that's so cute. He thinks that three people make a decision. Like, I
Yeah.
don't think I ever encountered a decision at Google that was made by three people. It
Yeah.
was usually more like 25, right? Like you had the lines of approval and the lines of
Yeah.
alignment. So I think here we're now talking about decision making in a larger organization where you
Yeah.
need to get alignment, where you need to get consensus. It's different from individual decision making, right? Where it's just I own the decision, I own the consequences. Here we're talking about getting multiple folks bought in, etc. I know you had spoken about this with decision rights, right? And sort of speaking about, okay, do I have the right? Who has the right? Can you share more just on the recording? What are decision rights and how do they play in at small organizations versus large?
Yeah, I that connects to yeah, what we're saying about different sizes of companies, and maybe I'll just introduce decision rights. It's just there are many ways to approach decision making. You talked earlier about intuitive, analytical, or a process. This is another thing. It's like who literally decides and what is the method by which they decide. And so the simplest one is what we've said, which is you're a leader and you just decide. Like you have an intuition or you've done the analysis, whatever it is, you're kind of a decider of one. And then you can kind of go through a progression of different types of decisions that involve more people, involve more alignment work, which increases the buy-in at the expense of speed. And so there's like two dimensions you have to think about. And you could start with either one as the first. You could say, okay, time is fixed, something's going to happen. My car is going 60 miles an hour. I have to take the exit or not. You have 30 seconds to make a decision, so time might be fixed. Whereas in another example, you might be working on something where you're like, what's most important is the amount of buy-in I have. I can flex the amount of time it takes in order to achieve that level of buy-in. So there are two dimensions you can think about because this kind of goes linearly across both. And so leader is the first one. Then there's leader with input, which means you ask people on the team or whomever, but you're still making the decision as a leader. You could delegate that decision to a subgroup which has to come up with some way to make a decision as a group. You could say that the subgroup needs to go get input from other group. You could take everyone involved and decide that you're going to do some sort of like majority decision. The next is consensus, which is where you essentially don't have anyone opposed. Like, okay, we all agree in general we can do this, but there's no opposed. And then the last is alignment, where you go beyond not they're not only unopposed, everyone's enthusiastically, pushing for the thing you have. So that's the biggest buy-in but takes the most time. And so that's the array of options that go up that kind of cost and buying curve. But, I see issues where one, it's one of these things that if you've never learned this framework, you don't realize it. But in retrospect, you're like, oh, right, okay, we had this a committee and we told the committee that they can come up with a decision and present it back. Or, you're like, oh, well, we were voting. And so that's majority. And so you see where they came up. Having this framework allows you to be more intentional about it. And I think that really helps provide clarity. Clarity is kindness. And so if you're making a decision as a leader, you should be clear about what kind you're doing and why. So sometimes there's a misconception on a team where you think the leader is deciding with input. And so you provide your input, but they didn't want your input because that's not how they were going to make a decision. And you get frustrated as a input provider, but it turns out they had a reason for not doing that. So it's really important to be clear. So anyway, those are the decision rights as I know them. What are your thoughts on that?
It's interesting because it's now making me like, if I'm reflecting back the types of things we're discussing, just to help myself mentally bucket them. We would talk about decisions, there are types of decisions, right? Types of decisions you can make, and I'll just put them as like hats and tattoos for now.
Mhm.
Then there are types of decision-making processes you can use, right? Intuitive, analytical, some other process led. And then the thing you're coming up with around decision rights to me almost feels like what's the type of decision maker, right? Like who's the who of this? Is it like a leader with it? Like it almost is. It's partly about the process that you take to make decision, but it's partly about the who's sort of holding responsibility for the decision. And it is it one person? Is it one person with input? It is it multiple people? Is it a committee? And so there's almost what's the decision? What's the type of decision and the way you want to decide it, and then what's the level of ownership you want to give around who's ultimately making the call.
Yeah.
Really interesting the number of ways you can look at the same process now.
Yeah. Well,
I see
I'm
you
laughing
laughing.
because we talked about decisions are easy. You just decide. Like at some level, you're just like snap, snap, decide. But we've spent an hour describing all of the different nuance around decisions, and so it's one
Yep.
of those. The more you know, the more complex something can become. And I think so. Yeah, that makes sense. That it is pretty complex here. But there's actually, I was going to bring up something we haven't talked about yet, which is, if that's okay, just actually, if you remember my decision before on which path, this is the other path I didn't take. So this path is talking about decision trees. And the reason I was thinking about it back then was around probabilities and the fact that, you don't have this perfect system where A equals B and it always equals B and you can kind of predict what's going to happen. You're living in this world. So a decision tree is essentially, I'm going to draw something which is not good for auditory, but it's this path. We talk about branching paths. It's where you draw them. You say, oh, I'm going down this path. Then there's some sort of node, and then three different things could happen from that. And what this allows you to do is to, as a decider, is a couple of things. One, you recognize probabilities and start to put them some math to paper. You're like, there's a 10% chance that this could happen. So you could think about quitting a job, just because that's your example. That's something I did recently. So that's a no, that's a decision that you're going to make. And then you could say, okay, well, I immediately crush it, and everyone's pounding down my door, and they're throwing money at me. That's a 2% chance or whatever that is. And you can kind of go through and you're like, oh, at the bottom, no one knows I exist. I'm destitute. My family has to abandon their house, like whatever that is, and you can put them on there. But you're just kind of going through these options. You create an outcome for each one of those probabilities, and now you're creating an expected value kind of you're like, oh, if I do this, then the expected value. So it's a way to make something a little bit analytical. So even though there's probabilities, you're arraying all your options, you're putting some math on it, and you're making a much more educated decision. The other thing that it does is it does a little bit of, you're learning second order thinking because you're looking down and you're like, oh, what's the next decision or what's the next option or what's the next node? And you're kind of seeing, oh, well, if this happens, then I could do this. And so you can start to see the second and third order thinking from your original decision kind of spiders out into a lot of things, which then I talk about doing time travel to make good decisions. And I think about it, you're literally walking down these nodes. You're like, oh, okay, I made this decision and now I'm in the one where people are throwing money at me and I'm amazing. Like, what does that feel like? Then you go to the other one and you're like, what does that feel like? And so that time travel, maybe bringing back the intuition, it brings another element into the analysis there as you're doing that. So decision trees are a really good way to assess your probabilities and think in second order effects and use time travel to generate intuition to make better effective decisions. What are your thoughts on decision trees?
Well, and so the decision trees in that expected value calculation, I feel like I took that from Annie Duke's book, was just sort of, oh, I can actually calculate the probability this will happen and the value if it happens. I love that. As an analytical person, that has helped me make some decisions of, I think I want to launch A or B service.
Yeah.
What's the likelihood that I could book this and how would I price this and what would the satisfaction be, right? Like I can sort of look at a few outcome variables and calculate it, and it's made some of those decisions much easier because I have that sort of expected value calculation. So that one I love. It's funny, a lot of the other frames you were thinking of were related to this book by the Heath brothers, this book Decisive. They were arguing that there's sort of four ways to get around the four villains of decision making. And I think the processes you're mentioning address each of them. So I'll just share what's spiking for me here. So the first where they said, okay, the danger of narrow framing, their suggestion is explore the option space fully. I think a decision tree allows you to do that. So it's like forcing you to say, like Nisi, what's possible. The way they suggested to do it is to just ask yourself, okay, I'm framing this decision of should I do A or B? What if you could do both?
Mhm.
What would it look like to do A and B, right? To almost force yourself to not create a false dichotomy where there isn't one. They suggest that you verbalize and reality test your assumptions, right? And so often to prevent confirmation bias, we have these assumptions of, oh, this will go this way, this will go that way. So the more you can sanity check those with talking to other people, input, market data, analysis, you can check whether your assumptions about outcomes are realistic. And again, this is for a very slow decision. Let's take the decision of like, should I fire someone, right? Like that's one where there's a higher cost to course correct. Testing your assumptions there might be really useful. Go out and talk to folks about performance, check whether your assumptions around the performance are similar. The third thing they suggest is create distance from emotion. And I think your time travel allows you to do that. The example they gave in the book, which was a really interesting one, it was from Andy Grove leading Intel at this
Mhm.
point where they had to choose whether to go, whether to stay with memory or move into microprocessors. And Andy Grove tells the story that he basically said, okay, if they fired us and
Yep.
brought in a new CEO, what would our successors do?
Yep.
They would get out of memory right away. And so for him, the what would our successors do allowed him to time travel in such a way that took himself out of the decision. You're nodding, maybe you've heard this
I
anecdote.
love that story. I love that
Right,
story. They walk around the
right.
building. It's a great framing. Keep going, but I love
And it's
that.
and again, I don't know how to put that into individual decision making for careers because like your successor, like,
Right.
but you could say like, hey, say someone else, your friend
Yes.
transported into your
Right.
shoes, like what would they do? Can help to create that distance from the identity that we put around it. And then the fourth one they mentioned, just to prevent the this last overconfidence one, is prepare to be wrong, right?
Mhm.
Prepare to be wrong. And I know you bristle at
Yep.
wrong, like prepare to make a decision that has consequences you didn't expect, right? Even if you have this process, there is randomness. There are assumptions you're going to have wrong, probabilities you're going to have wrong, or you may have the probabilities exactly right, and you may just fall into a low probability situation. And so I think that prepare to be wrong, at least for me personally, that one gives me more permission to just go make the decision to recognize the costs of indecision. So I liked that one. But I think all four of these really give you a lot of um, ways to prevent these villains of decision making as they cast them from influencing your decision. And so when you were talking about those approaches, for me, they were aligning with those categories. What
Yeah.
stands out?
I love testing assumptions. It makes me think of I think it's Netflix and Reed Hastings' No Rules rules, where you seek contrary opinion, like you're going around and you're farming for dissent, I think is how they frame it. You're really pressure testing. That's a good way to get out of that confirmation bias you talked about earlier, so you're getting people to challenge it. I did love that anecdote, and I do think it's they use the successor framing, but anything that gets you out of yourself and you say like, what would someone else, if I were giving them advice, what advice might I give them? And so that's a really good mental model to do. I don't remember what you said. It was being wrong. There's a question I like. I'm not going to challenge the wrong. I'm not going to get into that. I just going to say, like, what could you learn? And, again, if you think about, oh, what if I'm wrong and I quit and something happens? I like Cal Newport talking about money being a neutral value indicator, and especially on this career change thing. Like, what could you learn? Go test that people, like, go shadow someone in that career that you're debating doing that's so different from what you're doing. Try to convince people to pay you to solve problems in that area, and do they? And do you like doing it? There's all those things. So where you might look at this really big decision, and there may be a way to figure out what could I learn to influence what I've set here as far as options or probabilities, and just really emphasizing the learning loops, I think is another really good thing.
It's interesting though, because as you're talking about that last one and the learning loops, I'm thinking about these career decisions and the type of wrong that it is. And I think often the wrong is almost it's a change in identity, right? When I see folks leave academia, they have to let go of this academic identity. And it's a little bit cult-like, really,
Yeah.
academia. It's like really like, who am I if I am not this? And so almost instead of prepare to be wrong for that choice, for a career choice, it's prepare to step into who you're becoming instead of who you've been. And
Yep.
so per that atomic habits notion that like you've got to have a new identity to really underscore those new habits. Yes, when you're making a big choice, like a career change that is about you, you are stepping into a new identity. You're no longer a leader at Atlassian. You now are an
Mhm.
entrepreneur, right? And that is
Yep.
a new identity, I think, probably by the time you made the choice, you were ready to step into. But a lot of folks, when you've held an identity for a long time, it's not wrong. It's just prepare to be not this feels really
Yeah. I
uncomfortable.
know this will get off decision making for a moment and talk specifically about this in my experience. I wanted to share like that example for me. I have an identity, a lifelong one of being shy and introverted. And when I had this debate with myself about this decision, there was something, certainly there was identity, but part of it was learning where like I've had people like say bad bosses tell me that I would not be good at X because of that label. And that stuck with me. And it's like, oh, this person that I respect ostensibly is telling me this. And, but it's just a perspective they have. And it turns out they were wrong because I was afraid when I went out, oh, the shy introverted person will never be able to do sales because you've got to talk to people and somehow convince them. But it turns out I'm pretty good at sales. And that's because I care deeply about the person I'm talking to. I'm very creative in coming up with ways to solve problems. And that's kind of all you need, or at least that's what I've learned. And so I did have to work through that identity transition in order to do that. And I did that through the learning. I went out and tried to sell things. Okay. That was like, okay, Kevin, like test it. Like don't leave before you know whether this is really going to be the sticking point for you, because that would be a much worse, going back to wrong. That would be a wrong way to approach this. So anyway, that was my experience with the decision making, the identity is kind of testing things and having to work through that transition by figuring out whether it was true or not.
Well, and I'm glad you did that. It speaks to, and again, I coach folks in this space all day, so I'll speak to examples I see frequently, which is it's easy for our assumptions to tell us a story that confirms our bias, right?
Mhm.
Like,
Yeah.
I know if I go out to entrepreneurship because I'm shy, I won't be able to sell. Okay, good. Good excuse to stay in your comfort zone,
Yep.
right? But if we take this decision-making framework that is, let's test those assumptions, assuming like, are you as shy as you assume?
Mhm.
Is shy as much of a limiting factor as you assume?
Mhm.
Are there ways to do this that allow a shy person to do it, or are there techniques, right? Like there's just so many assumptions that you can test there. And so when you go out and gather the data, you often find your confirmation bias that wants to keep you safe, that wants to keep you insane, that wants to keep you in the comfort zone. It'll make up all sorts of stories
Yep.
and make you believe that they are very true. But to the
Yep.
extent that we can question our assumptions, we can question our beliefs. I would say the same thing happens for leaders. Leaders have a lot of overconfidence of sort of the thing that I'm doing must be right because I'm a leader and I know my stuff. I actually, sorry, I got sidelined there for a moment. Can I take one brief
Yeah.
sidetrack of leader overconfidence? Do you follow Stephen Bartlett, this Diary of 100 CEOs guy?
Yeah. I think I'm aware. I probably picture him, but no, I don't follow his stuff.
I'm on his newsletter, which is like we asked 100 CEOs this question, da 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 da, and one of them had such this like tone of overconfidence, this halo effect that I had to write back. I wrote back and said like, you're asking CEOs, here, but like, how do you know that? Like, how are they experts in this? Like,
Mhm.
I believe they have some experience in it. Are they experts? And so it to me felt like such an exercise of this like inflation of ego around overconfidence. And so I think CEOs, leaders, often because they've gotten to a position of power, they can tell themselves a story that they earned it, that it's because they
Sure.
made decisions, et cetera. And I think the more we can question that and say, yeah, I know stuff. I've made some good choices. Do I know everything? I'm an expert in everything. I do think that success and power in one area can inflate our overconfidence even further. And to the extent that we can check our overconfidence and then check our underconfidence, right? For career next steppers, it's often underconfidence. For
Yep.
CEOs, it's a little bit of overconfidence radiating
Yep.
out to, hey, I know everything. I've
Yep.
also seen this for martial arts masters, right? Folks who are master in one thing think they know everything. It's like, what? So don't underconfident yourself, but don't overconfident yourself.
That's it. Keeping the humility, like there's a challenge for leaders in decision making. You have to have the drive to push things forward. We talked about speed, the cost of inaction, all that stuff. But you also have to have the humility that you could be wrong or there's something missing or the different approach. So as it relates to decision making, I would say humility is a very important characteristic to balance your drive.
Anything else around decision making that you wanted to call out that we haven't covered?
Yeah, I just wanted to close maybe some heuristics, just some rules of thumb. And, you were kind of bringing up earlier, and I was thinking, often the decision you're resisting is the one you should probably choose. And I think that's because most of us operate out of fear and self-preservation too much. And so if you're resisting something, that means you're probably trying to stay in the status quo, but that may not be, what's best for you. Or, I just wrote a newsletter on leading an interesting life and kind of this saying yes to a lot of things. And, I think that just a rule of thumb, like at least pause. Why are you resisting something? Maybe that's a clue that's actually the one you should choose. And I would say, well, I'll stop there. I have two more, but any reaction to that first one?
It reminds me of I was just listening to Laurie Santos, who teaches the course at Yale about well-being, right? And it's now like the largest course at Yale ever. And she basically talks about, she's a fellow evolutionary biologist by training, she's a psychologist, talks about how our brains are wired for survival. And
Mhm.
so they're going to want us to make the survival-oriented decision. But for things like which workspace plan should I choose, survival is not really in the
Yeah.
cards, but our heuristics are still going to go to survival. And so looking at those and saying, okay, in order to thrive, in order to flourish, we sometimes have to check those survival instincts and actually put them on a shelf and do the exact opposite. So I think that for me aligns with the what's the decision I'm resisting? Really checking, am I in survival mode or am I in thrival mode? And I think the same happens for businesses. Am I freaking out that my business is going to go underwater and making decisions from that frame? Or am I looking for something that allows us to best contribute profitably towards our mission? I think that is what comes to mind when you say that first one of the decision you're avoiding is probably the one you should be making,
Yep.
connects to, am I just in survival mode right now?
Yep. The next one I was going to say is choose the thing that creates more options for you. So optionality is a really, I don't know, it's a huge benefit. And so, if you see, I could choose this thing, but then I have this narrow frame, like maybe a literal narrow frame. I could only maneuver in this narrow boundary. Even if the expected value of that is pretty high, you may want to consider the thing that actually gives you a lot of optionality. And so again, it's another pause and just kind of think like choose the option that gives you more optionality is just a good rule of thumb. Anything on that one?
Can you give an example there?
Well, me leaving my job, there's only so many options in the role I was in and the path that I was on, and so choosing to go independent that then meant I had an infinite choice of all the things in the world that I could do to create value, and so that was a part of the reason to move is because the optionality was greater as an independent than it was going to be, inside a company.
And so choose the thing that allows you more degrees of freedom
Correct.
under your individual locus of control.
Yeah, I could ask. I think about the locus of control part, but I can tell you're pondering my example there.
Yeah, well, because I think I push back. I think folks have a lot more freedom to craft their jobs in a job than they think they do. And so there is a
Okay.
perceived limitation in the job. And yes, there are other people around you who are doing things, but I guess I see you as having the same opportunity and optionality at all of those moments. You
Hmm.
may perceive that you have more optionality. And like if you give
Sure.
yourself more permission, great. But just as a coach, I hold that like you had
Sure.
you had optionality in all those places. It's not like it
Uh,
wasn't there.
but you're reinforcing that optionality is valuable. You're just on my particular example, you think that I had more options than I'm conveying in my original, but you agree that optionality is valuable.
Maybe. I think even
Interesting.
that one I would disagree because I think sometimes like choosing to commit, right? Like if you choose to be in a long-term relationship, you are shutting down options of all the other people you could have dated. And yet sometimes that is the choice that is valuable. So I don't know that choosing option, and again, it's a very different type of choice. It's possible that in
Sure.
business, choosing optionality, but like sometimes choosing to close a bunch of doors actually does bring a lot of value and joy. So I don't know.
Sure.
I should always choose optionality.
Well, I think that's the fun thing about heuristics is they're a rule of thumb, not a mandate. And so I do think it's a thing to say like, okay, I have a choice. Which one of these is going to give me more options? But you're right, you're going to find cases in which you shouldn't follow that. And so it's not a rule, it's just a thing to when you're engaging with something, pause and reflect on that element of it before kind of committing down a thing. And then the last one I had is, choose the option that creates more upside than downside. And again, all these heuristics are Kevin Noble's own. You can disagree with each one of these, but and this might get a little bit into expected value stuff. What do I really mean by that? But if you're looking at the upside of something, I think part of it is upside can often be like infinite, whereas downside has a finite thing. And so if you're choosing something, look for where there's a lot of upside as opposed to downside. This does remind me a little bit, if my wife ever listens to this, skydiving. She has done that several times, not since we had children, because I think a lot of expected, and I do the math, oh, there's a X% chance that you could die. That's a really extreme outcome. I would avoid scenarios in which there's a huge downside. But I've since learned after 20 years of marriage, like the way she does decisions is very different. And it kind of looks at the average outcome. And so she'll choose like, well, there's a 99.8% chance that I'm gonna have an exciting thrill. And, just different people make different decisions in different ways. And but I do think looking for where there's a lot of upside is in general a good rule of thumb.
Yeah, though it's so funny because I shouldn't open another door right as we're closing our conversation, but a friend from college is a professor who studies uncertainty and decision making under uncertainty, and now he's consulting with companies on that. And one of the things he posits around these decisions under uncertainty, and where you can get lack of alignment, is different definitions of value, right?
Mhm.
So like upside and downside presume that like we have one yardstick where we can measure. But
Yep.
if I have one definition of value and trade-offs and you have another, as you're seeing with your wife, right? Like, or there it's even just there it's the tolerance of the downsides. But like the what do we consider valuable? I
Mhm.
think outside of business settings where you can do a quick back of the envelope revenue calculation. But even there, you could say, is it short-term revenue or is it long-term revenue? Is it,
Yep.
money in the pocket now or long-term
Yep.
customer satisfaction? So I do think there's also the question of like, on what value scale are you calculating upside and downside? And does everyone have the same definition of value?
Yes, very important. Because values means what you value. And I will say that one of mine is adventure. I do like optionality. So therefore, I have a rule of thumb that says like the more options, the better. And I also have one around stability. Maybe that's why I think about upside. If there's enough upside, then, I'm in a more stable place, even though someone else may choose the, highly variable outcomes because that's thrilling or some, I don't know. There's many different things. And I know we're closing doors, not opening them, but I do think that's often when there's disagreements in decision making in companies or anywhere. Often it's because of that kind of value stuff, and there's these underlying assumptions or values that people are putting different emphasis on, and so they come to different conclusions. But people argue the conclusion. Really important to dive into assumptions and values to say, oh, if you value this instead of that. Oh, yeah, I would agree with you. Okay, then now we can debate the value versus the conclusion.
Yeah, I see that every day coaching within individuals where they have competing commitments to competing values of theirs, and the two values they're telling them to do different things. And so they sit there in indecision because they say, wait, my value of adventure is telling me one thing, but my value of stability is telling me another.
Yes.
Which way do I go? Right? Those
Yep.
internal conflicts come up
Yep.
and they come up between individuals at companies as well. So I think it's important to call that out. Well, Kevin, we have talked about this
Yeah.
easily. We have filled a lot of time.
Yep.
I really enjoyed chatting with you about decision making. Hopefully, folks who have listened or watched have taken away reframe themselves and how they view decision making, maybe a little bit more respect for how tricky it is to do effectively. Hopefully, folks have taken some tools and some practices and processes that they can use to combat those heuristics. Anything else you want to say as we close?
No, that was a rich vein of discussion on decision making. I think there's a lot more that could be discussed. We can say that for future, talk cognitive biases. I know we sort of touched on them with confirmation bias and others, but yeah, so that was great though. I hope people got some good stuff out of that.
Yay. All right. Well, onwards to make more decisions.
Thank you, Tori.
But for now, we'll make the decision to close our conversation here.
All right, bye bye.